The world watches tonight as the geopolitical dial spins past yellow and slams straight into red. We are witnessing an extraordinary and dangerous convergence of rhetoric and readiness between Moscow and the NATO alliance. The fuse has been lit, and it is a nuclear fuse. Just hours ago, NATO leadership, citing intelligence assessments so severe they demanded immediate public warning, stated that Russia is planning a major, potentially preemptive strike against targets far deeper than the current frontline allows. This is not idle speculation. This is the alliance putting its members on notice that a sudden, massive shift in Russian strategy is possible, perhaps imminent. This dire warning comes directly on the heels of the Netherlands Prime Minister Mark Rutte's uncompromising declaration that Europe must ready itself for an actual war footing, moving beyond mere support and preparing for direct engagement. Rutte's words, a direct challenge to Russian intent, were not allowed to linger unanswered. The Kremlin immediately fired back with language so sharp and uncompromising that it ripped away the last vestiges of diplomatic nuance. Moscow's reply did not mince words. It was an exhibition of the raw force of political will, directly targeting Rutte and anyone echoing his call for proactive readiness. Russia accused Western leaders of actively accelerating a catastrophic confrontation. What we are seeing is the page turning in real time, moving away from proxy warfare and toward a potential scenario where deterrence fails entirely. The statements emerging from both sides are no longer warnings. They are strategic challenges designed to harden into posture. Every major capital in Europe is being forced to internalize the reality that this confrontation leans dangerously toward escalation. The Kremlin made it crystal clear. NATO's increasing readiness and the deployment of advanced long-range weaponry are seen not as defensive measures, but as preliminary steps toward hostile military action against the Russian Federation itself. The shock waves from these exchanges are already being felt across global energy markets, but the true impact is measured in the increased readiness of military installations from the Baltics to the Black Sea. NATO's warning suggests Russia could launch daring long-range operations, leveraging its deep strike capabilities not just to punish Ukraine, but to inflict meaningful operational damage on the supporting logistics nodes within NATO territory. This is the strategic threshold that has kept the peace, shaky as it has been for decades. That threshold is eroding before our eyes. The response from the Ministry of Defense in Moscow was perhaps the most unusually blunt threat issued since the height of the Cold War. They stated unequivocally that any NATO member facility deemed to be preparing or housing offensive military capabilities aimed at Russia will be immediately marked as a legitimate target. They drew a clear and terrifying red line. This is the Kremlin saying, without euphemism, that they will not be intimidated by rhetorical posturing or military buildup. Instead, they promised a resolute response that would involve proportional and decisive action against the command structures and hardware fueling the conflict. The language confirms what analysts have feared. The primary driver for Moscow's current strategic calculus is the prevention of what they term expanding this conflict through the sustained deployment of Western high-tech weaponry. They view NATO's warnings and Rutte's war preparation calls as confirmation that the West intends to fundamentally undermine Russian security interests permanently. This exchange is not theater. It is the deliberate placement of pieces on a board where the only acceptable outcome is absolute victory, and the consequence of loss is unthinkable. The escalation is undeniable. The stakes are everything. Now we turn to the architect of this latest, most profound shift in rhetorical gravity, Mark Rutte. The outgoing Prime Minister of the Netherlands and the presumed future Secretary General of NATO is not merely stating an opinion. He is establishing a new, chilling consensus. His assertion is clear, uncompromising, and terrifying. Europe must abandon the fiction of enduring peace. We are fundamentally at war. This is an extraordinary and dangerous paradigm shift, accelerating the conversion of defensive alliance theory into offensive operational doctrine. Rutte's message is the hard requirement that Europe must scale up its defense industrial base now, right now, because the threat is proximate and immediate. He demands a complete end to the complacency that has defined decades of European security policy and establishes the need for a sustained, high-intensity war footing. Moscow immediately fired back. Russian foreign ministry officials and high-ranking defense analysts view this proactive shift not as mere deterrence, but as deliberate preparation for hostile military action. They see Rutte's escalation thesis as the Western political elite moving beyond proxy conflict and hardening their commitment to direct confrontation. The Kremlin rejects the entire premise of the war footing narrative as a pretext for Western expansion. The core danger here is how quickly rhetoric can harden into posture. This is a moment where the raw force of political will is defining the very boundaries of future conflict. When a leader slated to command NATO adopts this level of uncompromising rhetoric, the entire alliance leans dangerously toward escalation. The political shock waves from this single statement alone are already redefining military planning across the continent. It is the immediate and concrete military implications that raise the gravest concerns. When NATO strategists discuss needing to scale up and prepare for conflict, Moscow hears preparation for daring long-range operations designed to inflict meaningful operational damage against Russian territory or key infrastructure. The Kremlin is not debating whether NATO is defensive. They are calculating NATO's precise willingness to strike first to preempt a perceived threat. The response from Russia has been an unusually blunt threat. Officials have made it crystal clear. Any infrastructure that supports these Western war preparations, logistical hubs, command and control centers, or the supply lines that Rutte is advocating for, will be designated as legitimate military targets. They have stated unequivocally that Russia will not be intimidated by these calls for open, unrestricted confrontation. This warning draws a heavy, bloody red line. It effectively tells NATO that the game of graduated response is ending. If you embrace the war footing philosophy, you embrace the immediate risk of expanding this conflict well beyond the current front lines. This is the definition of high-stakes tension. Both sides are now operating on the premise that they must deliver a resolute response to prevent the perceived aggression of the other. This situation transcends mere political maneuvering. We are watching the page turning in real time. The geopolitical landscape is no longer static. Every Western decision to supply longer-range weapons or adopt more aggressive operational doctrines is being interpreted by Moscow as a fundamental threat that must be neutralized immediately. Russia sees itself already engaged in total war with the West, and Rutte's statement confirms their deepest fears and legitimizes their most aggressive countermeasures. The only viable path forward for the Kremlin is to maintain and project the raw force of political will, ensuring that any move across their declared boundaries will be met with devastating consequence. The air is thick with the scent of sulfur. The tension is almost unbearable. This is not deterrence. This is confrontation guaranteed. The Kremlin has now officially fired back, dismissing the Western rhetoric, Rutte's warning, the NATO intelligence, as both hysterical and calculated. They label the idea that Russia is preparing for unprovoked strikes against NATO territory as an extraordinary and dangerous attempt at psychological warfare, designed, they argue, to justify preemptive Western escalation. This isn't merely diplomatic disagreement. It is a foundational clash over who controls the narrative of impending war. Moscow's foreign ministry declarations this week harden into posture, asserting that the very premise of NATO's warnings is rooted in a desire to expand this conflict beyond the current zone. They accuse NATO capitals of manufacturing panic to rally domestic support for continued, increasing military aid which Russia views as direct hostile involvement. This is the crux of their firewall, turning the accusation of impending Russian attack back onto the West as a provocation designed to trigger a conflict that nobody can control. We must dissect Russia's specific warnings, because the language coming out of Moscow is precise and perilously clear. The Kremlin states that any authorization for the use of Western-supplied, long-range munitions to strike targets deep inside internationally recognized Russian territory crosses a critical red line. This is the deliberate weaponization of the term provocation. They are no longer simply objecting to the supply of arms. They are defining the permitted operational use of those arms as the ultimate determinant of peace or all-out war. This specific operational shift, allowing daring long-range operations deep behind Russian lines, is seen not as defensive support, but as a deliberate act of war initiation by proxy. The deployment of precision strikes that inflict meaningful operational damage on Russian command centers, air defenses, or strategic nuclear infrastructure is the threshold they have explicitly defined as unacceptable. The military strategists in Moscow are specifying that if such meaningful operational damage is inflicted, the response will be immediate, multi-domain, and aimed directly at the suppliers and the logistical hubs used for launching these weapons. This specific operational shift leans dangerously toward escalation, far beyond the confines of the current theater. The message delivered this week constitutes an unusually blunt threat. It is a warning aimed squarely at Washington, London, and Berlin. Stop supplying the means for hostile military action against the Russian heartland, or face direct consequence. The Kremlin's chief spokesperson, backed by the Security Council, declared that Russia will not be intimidated by the Western alliance's perceived military superiority or their economic sanctions regime. This is the raw force of political will articulated, an unconditional refusal to yield ground on territorial integrity or perceived sovereign defense. They are cementing the psychological pressure, stating unequivocally that any breach of this declared red line guarantees a resolute response. That resolute response, they suggest, will send shock waves across the globe. This is not saber-rattling intended for domestic consumption. It is calculated, high-stakes diplomacy meant to freeze Western decision-making through the undeniable fear of nuclear confrontation. They are challenging NATO to call their bluff, betting that NATO lacks the collective will to risk the total destruction that accompanies truly expanding this conflict. The strategic reality is this. Russia is establishing a firewall built not of steel, but of nuclear rhetoric and uncompromising resolve. They are betting that the inherent risk of direct nuclear confrontation will paralyze NATO's willingness to cross the threshold they have set. We are witnessing the page turning in real time, shifting from proxy conflict management to a direct, if still rhetorical, standoff between nuclear powers. Every diplomatic move, every shipment of ammunition, is now analyzed within this framework of confrontation guaranteed. The atmosphere is fraught, pregnant with the possibility of miscalculation, forcing the world to recognize that the line between geopolitical tension and widespread conflagration is now thinner than a razor's edge. The Kremlin believes that by defining their red lines so aggressively, they place the onus of global catastrophe squarely on Western shoulders if those lines are breached. But rhetoric is only the casing. Inside, the charge is live. This isn't just a war of words. It is an extraordinary and dangerous period marked by an unprecedented level of surveillance and counter-surveillance activity across the entirety of the Northern European theater. When NATO leadership, especially Secretary General Stoltenberg, fired back at Moscow's aggressive pronouncements regarding Ukraine aid, they signaled that the alliance understands the calculus has fundamentally changed. This entire dynamic is now less about abstract diplomatic maneuvering and more about the raw force of political will being tested in the unforgiving landscape of the Baltic states. The intelligence assessments coming out of Brussels and Langley paint a grim picture, suggesting that this geopolitical page is turning in real time, moving decisively away from the constraints of a mere proxy conflict and towards something that could harden into posture that is militarily impossible to safely unwind. The tension now leans dangerously toward escalation because the very definition of the threat matrix has fundamentally shifted. Analysts are no longer worried solely about a clumsy, accidental Article 5 triggering incident inside NATO territory, but rather about the very real possibility of Russia conducting daring long-range operations designed specifically to inflict meaningful operational damage on Western supply lines outside of Ukraine. If this scenario were to materialize, a targeted attack on logistics hubs, communications infrastructure, or even naval assets, the immediate shock waves would instantly rupture the already fragile stability of Europe. We are talking about precision strikes aimed at paralyzing the critical arteries of military support, potentially deep inside Poland or targeting supply nodes along the Scandinavian corridor. This is the calculus driving the current high-tempo military drills. While NATO conducts defensive maneuvers focused on rapid deployment, Moscow is not merely observing. The recent SNAP exercises conducted by the Russian Western Military District were an unusually blunt threat directed at NATO's eastern flank. These drills were focused explicitly on rapid deployment capabilities and simulated electronic warfare attacks against NATO member communications and command centers. They are effectively practicing the preemptive steps required before any widespread hostile military action. When Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov states emphatically that Russia's red line is non-negotiable regarding long-range Western missiles striking Russian soil, it is no longer interpreted in Washington as a mere diplomatic protest. It is a condition set forth under the explicit, implied threat of force. But NATO's response, led by Washington and amplified through the steadfast defense commitments to Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius, has been equally uncompromising. The West will not be intimidated. Any violation of sovereign territory, whether through kinetic means or coordinated cyber attacks deemed state action, will be met with a resolute response. This is the core tragedy of the shadow war we are now witnessing. Every defensive measure taken by the West is interpreted by the Kremlin as aggressive prepositioning and preparation for attack. Conversely, every Russian exercise, every deployment, is seen by NATO as preparation for expanding this conflict beyond its current boundaries and into the heart of the alliance. The mirror image threat perception is accelerating the timetable toward direct confrontation. We are observing the most significant forward deployment of strategic assets into the Baltic region since the depths of the Cold War. Joint intelligence committees are monitoring for what they term telltale indicators, a specific, simultaneous confluence of troop mobilization, strategic air asset movement, electronic signature changes, and strategic disinformation campaigns that would signal imminent movement. The risk assessment today isn't about speculating on if a major confrontation is possible. It is about calculating the precise point at which the current strategic ambiguity collapses entirely. The next 30 days, defined by ongoing Baltic drills and the continued high-frequency confrontational rhetoric, may prove to be the most crucial test of de-escalation capability the modern world has ever faced. We are watching the countdown begin. And as those seconds tick down, the global geopolitical framework is undergoing an extraordinary and dangerous transformation. Rutte's strategic warning, meant to steel NATO resolve, created instant shock waves across the world's capitals. Moscow fired back almost immediately, accusing the West of abandoning any pretense of dialogue in favor of military confrontation. This isn't diplomatic saber-rattling anymore. This is the raw force of political while meeting the raw threat of kinetic force. We are watching the page turning in real time, shifting out of the post-Cold War era and into something entirely new, something built on explicit hostility. The rhetorical shift from both sides threatens to permanently harden into posture. Where statements were once designed to leave strategic gaps for negotiation, they now act as operational mandates. NATO's enhanced forward presence, coupled with Rutte's blunt assessment that Europe must prepare for an immediate war footing, has crossed a threshold. The entire situation leans dangerously toward escalation. This isn't just about defense anymore. It's about preemptive readiness, and that is a major difference in the language of war. Moscow interprets these preparations not as defensive measures, but as plans for hostile military action. Their retaliatory statements have been an unusually blunt threat, detailing the specific consequences should NATO forces, or NATO-supplied assets, inflict meaningful operational damage on Russian infrastructure or territory. The specific mention of targeting command and control centers, and the threat of asymmetric response to what they term daring long-range operations, makes it clear. The red line is no longer conceptual. It is drawn in definitive, uncompromising terms, and the Kremlin has made it unequivocally clear that they will not be intimidated. These global shock waves extend far beyond the front lines. The economic fallout is already severe, yet understated. We are moving toward a bipolar economic reality where the global south must choose between sanctioned blocks and resource security. Energy markets are convulsing not just on price fluctuations, but on the viability of supply routes under threat of direct conflict. Major insurance markets are recalculating risk based on scenarios involving potential maritime conflict and infrastructure strikes. This isn't just a political crisis. It's an existential economic threat to global stability, propelled by the expanding this conflict rhetoric. The greatest danger now lies in miscalculation. Both sides are deploying maximally confrontational language, each believing that their resolute response is the only path to deterring the other. But when two nuclear-armed powers adopt uncompromising postures, the margin for error becomes infinitesimal. Any accidental engagement, any systemic failure, any misinterpretation of radar signals risks setting off an uncontrollable chain reaction. The future of NATO cohesion is fundamentally at risk. While Rutte's statements aimed for unity, the immediate operational burden falls disproportionately on frontline nations. Internal debate over the actual level of commitment, the speed of mobilization, and the deployment of sensitive assets threatens to fracture the alliance precisely when seamless cooperation is most needed. If member states fail to match the strategic rhetoric with immediate, unified operational capability, the perception of weakness will invite exactly the aggression they are trying to deter. The doomsday clock is ticking faster than we acknowledge. Every public statement, every large-scale drill, every hardening of a diplomatic stance brings us closer to a midnight hour defined not by diplomacy, but by destructive capability. We are past the point of rhetorical warnings. We are facing a high-stakes moment where the vocabulary of conflict is becoming the vocabulary of daily governance. The world is holding its breath, waiting to see if these extraordinary and dangerous pressures can be relieved, or if they must inevitably explode. The path we have traversed over these last critical hours confirms one terrifying truth. The diplomatic buffer zone has vanished. We are no longer discussing theoretical conflict. We are synthesizing actionable threats. Rutte's declaration that war may be coming, and the Kremlin's swift, furious response, where Moscow fired back accusing him of fanning the flames of hysteria, is the extraordinary and dangerous dynamic defining this moment. This section is not merely a recap. It is the epilogue of caution. We must analyze how quickly warnings harden into posture. When the raw force of political will is brought to bear, when major powers align their operational planning around the expectation of the other's imminent aggression, the system itself leans dangerously toward escalation. The rhetoric of both the Kremlin and key NATO leaders is designed to ensure the world knows they will not be intimidated. But this resolute response, articulated fiercely on both sides, simultaneously guarantees that any minor miscalculation risks a global catastrophe. The unanswered questions loom larger than the warnings themselves. We are watching a page turning in real time, but the next chapter remains unwritten, shadowed by existential ambiguity. What is the true operational threshold for NATO? Russia has shown its capability for daring long-range operations against Ukrainian critical infrastructure. If those operations spill over, if a missile intended for a Ukrainian target lands on NATO soil, is that the tripwire? And if not, what magnitude of hostile military action, short of a full-scale invasion, would qualify as crossing a red line? Is it the deliberate, successful targeting that causes meaningful operational damage to supply chains or cyber capabilities of a member state? The Kremlin has issued an unusually blunt threat regarding the targeting of assets used to funnel aid. If Moscow acts on that threat, striking logistics hubs in Poland or Romania, will NATO treat this as an act of war against the alliance? The alliance claims it maintains the right to strike back defensively, invoking the principle of proportionality. But defining proportionality in the context of nuclear-armed adversaries is a fool's errand. It is a formula for uncontrollable expansion. We have reached the synthesis point where geopolitical tension is measured in minutes, not months. The shock waves emanating from every new decision, every new deployment, threaten to fracture the remaining architecture of global security. The language of diplomacy has been replaced by the tactical language of artillery. The urgent demand is clear and uncompromising. De-escalation must be mandatory. This cannot be treated as a political preference. It must be treated as a biological imperative. Every action taken by Washington, by Brussels, and by Moscow must prioritize freezing the current escalation gradient. We are standing on a precipice where the maintenance of national pride and uncompromising firmness, the very refusal to be intimidated, is driving the world toward a lethal mistake. The continued focus on expanding this conflict through proxy support and enhanced targeting authorizations risks crossing the threshold into direct, kinetic confrontation between Russia and NATO, an outcome that promises only mutual annihilation. The raw force of geopolitical competition must yield to the raw necessity of peace. The vocabulary must shift immediately, or the consequence will be irreversible. This terrifying urgency defines our world right now.